Well, it's time to start talking about macro-emergent properties above the level of cells, tissues, organs, and organisms, and start talking about groups of organisms and groups of different populations of organisms. And so in this chapter, in this unit, we finally move to the level of ecology. And the introduction here at the start of this portion of the unit, the notes dive right into communities and how communities are important in macro-emergence. So we're up here, we're taking a look at communities as groups of interacting populations. And the first thing they want to drive home, the College Board wants to drive home, is that we use today a lot of mathematical modeling to actually estimate what's going to happen to us in the future. We use mathematical modeling to predict what's going to happen in the stock market. We use mathematical modeling to predict how many deer or how many turkey are going to be available in the state for the following season, so we know how many permits to issue hunters. And a very controversial aspect of mathematical modeling is the modeling that's used on weather patterns. And related to that is carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere have been on the rise for quite some time, and mathematical modeling has been used to predict that sea levels should rise at least 15 feet higher than their present levels by the year 2050. And that's based on the idea that carbon dioxide levels are going to be far in excess of 400 parts per million at that time because of all the combustion of fossil fuels. There are a lot of people that don't necessarily agree with the prediction of the model, but there are other models that actually predict that the sea levels will be much higher than 15 feet. The models are predicting at least 15 feet. So we dive in now, and mathematical modeling applies to population biology because we use mathematical models to predict and describe how populations grow. And we talked about this in class already, but the way that populations grow is basically a function of y equals 2 to the x, and it's right next to the little blue dot there. It's this green curve that describes the typical population growth model. And that goes for elephants, oak trees, moss plants, people. We all grow kind of what you see there in the green curve. Bacteria, the curve rises very sharply quickly. So for bacteria, you'll see a curve that looks more like that. And for elephants, you'll see a curve that stays low for a very long time because elephants reproduce very slowly and then rises quickly later. U.S. population growth follows that typical population growth pattern, as you see there from 1790 through the year 2000. Population's been growing exponentially. We are actually leveling off now. U.S. population now is growing more due to immigration than it is from births. So as we look down here, we look at the typical pattern by which populations grow, and that's the pattern you see here in this curve. So there are three different sections or phases to a typical population growth pattern. When you're starting out with a few individuals, which is what you'd have right there where you see A at the bottom of the graph, just a few individuals. This is like a few birds blowing off course and landing on an island, and there's a few males and there's a few females in the group. For a long time, the population doesn't even grow because there's no reproduction, but after a few seasons, there are more of those birds, more than likely, because there's reproduction, but the death rates are pretty low. If the birds are on a new island, chances are there's not a lot of predators there, and there's probably no new bird diseases on the island because there's no other birds to transmit diseases. The birds are not crowded, so they're not stressed, and there's probably ample food supply. So the death rates are very low, but the birth rates are also very low. Birth rates are higher than death rates, so the population grows. From B to C, though, in this interval through here, population growth is steep. And that's because during this time, there's more individuals. So now, with more individuals, you have more babies being added to the population. So the population starts to grow. It's a snowball effect. But death rates are still low because, again, there's few predators, there's no diseases, there's no crowding, and there's definitely food availability. But eventually, birth and death rates balance out, and you end up with this oscillating pattern, which you see at the top. And that oscillating pattern, it doesn't actually go straight flat line. That oscillating pattern is that way because the uh, climate, the weather is never constant. Some years are good, some years are bad, and some years there's more food, and some years there's less food. And as a result, you get, in good years, population goes up, and in bad years, the population goes down. So these three phases have names. The phase from A to B is the lag phase here, and that's when there's little to no growth, but birth is still higher than death rates, but it's not much higher. B to C is the exponential phase, where birth rates are far higher than death rates. And then C to D is the steady state. And it's at that time where birth rates basically are balancing out death rates. And if you'll notice, there's a dotted line coming over here on the graph, and there's a label here, E. E is the carrying capacity, which is about the average size of the population during the steady state portion of the population growth curve. This population growth curve right here is called a logistic growth curve. And that's because it accurately describes a population growth pattern that shows a lag phase, an exponential phase, and then followed by a steady state at the end. These two curves up above don't show those. The first curve is the y equals 2 to the x function. This curve does not show the steady state at the top, so it's not logistic. But that's the initial growth pattern of any population. What's more scary is what you see on the right over here, this growth pattern. This is a lag, exponential. Instead of a steady state, we got a crash. Crashes occur when you get an unfortunate influx of parasites or predators or a severe space limitation due to a volcanic eruption taking away growth, nesting sites, dens where animals live. And as a result, a bunch of animals die. In Ireland, the population was climbing, and around 1848, it was in excess of 8 million. And suddenly, a fungus appeared in Ireland that wiped out the cloned potato crop. And within a couple of years, mostly young kids, about 1 million folks, mostly youth, died from starvation. At least another 1 million emigrated to other countries, and the population sort of crashed to somewhere around 4 million. And it never has recovered. Even in the year 2015, we still haven't hit the population size where it once was at more than 100 years ago. So this is what population biology is all about. It's studying the growth of populations. And just so that we re-emphasize the obvious, if this is a bacteria population growth pattern, it grows very quickly, almost straight up. And for elephants and rhinoceri and things, it's a very slow growth. And the time frame here for elephants is thousands of years, and for bacteria, it's 100 minutes. Their population is growing exponentially. So, at any rate, we move on now to a little bit about demographics. There are ways to talk about the structure of a population, and the best way to do it is with a histogram. Now, you made a histogram earlier in the year with the plants that you grew, the mustard plants, and where you measured the hairs that were on the trichomes that were growing on the plants, and you put the plants into bins, and you basically assessed how many plants were in different bins of hairiness. Well, here what we have, and let's see if I can't make this a little bit larger, what we have is a histogram that describes the U.S. population, boys and girls from, let's see, birth up to about 80 plus years of age. And you'll notice we talked about this in class. There are more boys born than girls in a typical human population, and they think that's because the sperm with Y chromosomes are lighter than those with X's. But boys really do have more hormone problems than girls, and certainly by the age of 40, the population sizes between boys and girls have evened out. And is actually, if you can notice here, there's slightly more. You'll notice that the bars for girls here are a little bit closer to this side 12 million margin than they are for the boys over here for the same interval. And then the rest of the way up, you'll notice the boys are curving in pretty dramatically, and there's far more girls at 80 or women at 80 years of age than there are men at 80 years of age. And that's typical. That's the effects of testosterone across a lifetime. On the other hand, with a third world country, you don't see this relatively rectangular growth pattern like you see in the human population. The lower age brackets are relatively rectangular, and that's to be expected in a country where population growth is low, and the people that are being born are surviving till at least 50 years of age. Now, in third world countries, that is not necessarily the case. So, as a result, typical now here, Afghanistan, but this could be true. This is true of a lot of third world nations. You will notice that just as before, there are more boys born than girls. Again, the boys are a little less, like 2.7 million here, and there's only closer to 2.5 million girls. But the girl bars actually are curving in even faster than the boy bars. What we have here is a really high death rate, and girls are dying faster than boys. And that's not because of estrogen and hormone problems, it's because of births. The lack of medical care, prenatal care in third world countries, coupled with multiple births across a woman's lifespan, means that she's running a much greater risk of dying than her male counterparts. And so as a result, you have those two drastic differences. We have a triangle in this graph, whereas in the US graph, it was more rectangular, at least up to about 50 years of age. And secondly, we have a lack of girls, especially in the or excess number of girls in the upper age bracket. There should be more women surviving than men in a typical system, human system, but that's not the case here because of lack of prenatal care and excessive birthing events across a woman's lifetime. Which brings up then, we like to describe different organisms with different reproductive strategies. There are two general reproductive strategies on Earth. R selection and K selection. You remember natural selection from the first semester. Natural selection is, those organisms that are most fit survive and grow up and have babies, and the ones that are less fit die or have fewer babies because they're lacking features that make them reproductively successful. So R selection and K selection are two natural selection strategies. R selection strategies generally run with animals that live in environments that are commonly pretty unstable. So what we got here is an unstable environment. The life forms are generally kind of small, so these are bugs and frogs and things. And the parents generally are producing offspring that are absolutely tiny. They're just laying eggs, and they're not having large babies at birth. And they're reproducing huge numbers of offspring that grow very fast, so they have a very early maturity. But they have a short life expectancy. Generally speaking, each individual will get only one chance at reproduction, or very few, because you don't live long enough to have multiple reproductive events. And usually they have a type 3 survivorship pattern. Type 3 survivorship is where if you graph percentage of organisms surviving versus time, from the outset you have a plummeting survivorship curve, and then it tends to level off and becomes asymptotic with the x-axis over time. So frogs and a lot of bugs are in that category. Humans are in the opposite category. We're K-selectors. We stabilize our environment. We're much bigger. We invest a huge amount of energy in our kids. We have very few offspring per reproductive event. I mean, twins for people are kind of unusual. We usually just have one baby at a time. And we reach puberty late. Instead of puberty in the first year, we don't reach puberty until at least 12 years of age. But we have a long life expectancy, and we usually can reproduce more than once in our lifetime. In this case, we usually have one or two in terms of the survivorship patterns. Birds like Max often have a linear survivorship curve relationship. We, on the other hand, have a fairly flat curve, and then later in life, the curve plummets as we start to die due to factors of old age. So you'll notice these three different survivorship curves that are displayed here describe, type 1 is humans. Lots of mammals fall in the type 1 category. Birds, some snakes, and some reptiles fall in the type 2 category. Type 3 is lots of fishes, frogs, and lots of insects. Many invertebrates fall in the type 3 survivorship curve. And so that's the different ways we describe reproductive events, reproductive capabilities with different kinds of animals. Which brings us now to the next topic on the agenda is, where is all the energy in an ecosystem? Well, first off, it's really important to note that in an ecosystem, energy is not recycled, okay, but chemicals are. So, the chemicals that are in your body have been in dinosaur bodies. At least one atom in your body was in the body of Jesus Christ. We are about every 7 years, every atom in our body is completely replaced with new atoms. But the energy, on the other hand, that you're using right now is virgin. It came from the sun not long ago. It was stored by a plant. You ate the plant, or you ate an animal that ate the plant, and that energy is now coming to you. It might have been helped along by fossil fuel, but it came from the sun. It was solar energy, traveled 93 million miles. It hit a plant leaf. It got stored in a sugar. You used the sugar. You took that energy and incorporated it into the chemistry of your body. Eventually, you'll use it as ATP energy, if you recall, in the lovely metabolic reactions that occur in the human body. So, time to move on and talk about productivity, which is what the whole energy dynamics lab was all about. This is an interesting graph here before we dive in. It does describe productivity across the globe. For the aquatic ecosystems, purple is the most productive. And you'll notice down here in the South Pacific, we're very productive. Out here in the Western Pacific, the Earth is very productive. In the Southern Atlantic, we've got a high productivity. Southern Indian down here, we've got high productivity. So seriously productive zones there. And then if you'll notice, and that's, by the way, where chlorophyll A is concentrated. And chlorophyll A is an indication of producers doing photosynthesis and storing solar energy. So we have really intense solar energy being stored in all these little red dots you see now on this graph. Now, if you look in North America, we're pretty productive in the green belt here. I'll put a dot there. We're very productive in the Amazon basin there. We're very productive in the Congo, and Indonesia and the Far East is also seriously high productivity regions out here. On terrestrial ecosystems, those are the great forests of the world. Lots of chlorophyll, lots of plants producing foodstuffs. So that's kind of a world map showing you where is all the energy going when it comes to the food chains. So now this picture describes a food chain. And the most important thing to understand here is that each one of these pictures of animals is a population. There's a population of bald eagles, a population of osprey. So if you look at the top of the graph, the bald eagle there is a population. The osprey is a population of wading birds like the great blue heron, of bass, of sea ducks, of tundra swan, of bivalves, of little herbivorous ducks. The important thing to note is that there's always far more producer than there are consumers feeding on them. In fact, there's 90% more phytoplankton than benthic invertebrates. The general rule on Earth is there's about a 90% loss of energy in the transfer between each step. So as a result, you will always have more animals at the lower parts of the food chain than you will at the higher levels in the food chain. So what you see here is at the very top, you see a triangular pyramid here. What this is trying to describe is the food chain and food web relationships in a typical ecosystem. And in this case, what we have is a forest ecosystem. And what we're trying to say here is the size of that red triangle in the top is representing a top carnivore, and the size of that triangle is smaller than this part of the pyramid below it. And what we're saying here is that there is less fox or top carnivore biomass than there is in frogs and snakes, which the foxes eat. And in turn, there is more biomass of squirrels, bugs, and birds than what the snakes and frogs are eating. And we're saying that there's more trees and flowers and little herbivorous plants and aquatic plants than there are of the herbivores. In fact, at every step between, and this is called a trophic structure graph, by the way, in every step in any ecosystem, in any area, when you have a producer set of communities interacting with herbivore communities, which are, I'm sorry, populations. When you have producer populations interacting with herbivore populations, or interacting with primary carnivores, these are primary carnivores. These are top carnivores or secondary carnivores. You always have far more organisms below than above. And that's because every time somebody eats something, as you learned in um, the lab you just did with the worms and the plants, when you eat something, most of what you ate, you do not incorporate as body mass. You actually exhale it as carbon dioxide and water. Very little of the food stuff actually gets stored in the bodies of the animals that eat them. Most of the energy in the food stuff is used in the economy of the animal, but energy doesn't weigh anything. But the chemicals that store the energy in the foodstuffs, only a little bit of those chemicals actually gets stored in the bodies of animals that eat things. So every time you do a transfer from level to level, you have a 90% loss of energy between the steps. As a result, when you look at any typical food chain or food web diagram, you have to understand that there are far more organisms down at the bottom, down here, this is a producer, than there are up above. And furthermore, all arrows face up towards the animal doing the eating. So to properly fill in this food chain, you would put arrows to, not, for example, we would put the arrow pointing towards the snake because snakes eat squirrels. Squirrels don't eat snakes, but squirrels eat bugs. And so we have an arrow going from the bug to the squirrel. So in general, food webs describe some of the most important relationships among the life forms in a community. It is not wise to hike in a community and immerse yourself in a landscape unless you understand the food web that you're walking in, because you certainly don't want to become part of the food web. That brings us now to all of the different aspects of living with prey getting eaten by predators, but prey eating plants. We talked about this relationship that you see on the computer here back in the first quarter. Predator and prey populations oscillate up and down. So you'll notice the prey's going up and down, and the predator's going up and down with them, but the predators are always lower than the prey, and that's because every time a predator eats a prey, most of the atoms of the prey that were eaten are exhaled as carbon dioxide and water. Very little is incorporated into the predator body. There's a 90% plus energy loss as the predator burns the energy that the prey provided in metabolism. The reason for the oscillations is ultimately what you don't see on the graph is plants do not grow constantly. Some years are good and some years are bad. And so some years when there's more plants, the prey populations rise, which allows the predator populations to rise because with more prey, more predators survive. On the other hand, in bad years, which are drought usually, there are less prey surviving because there are fewer plants, and that means there's less predators because more of them are starving or dying, and as a result, the predator populations plummet too. So these graphs oscillate not because the prey are being eaten by the predators. The oscillations are ultimately being caused by weather patterns affecting the producers. But the reason the predators are always lower than the prey is because the predators lose most of the energy of the prey as they consume them. Okay, so I think at this point I will close on this topic and then begin again, because the rest of the program is kind of going to basically deal with a lot of human interactions with the biosphere. And so I'll stop at this point and we'll start another movie, and we'll talk more about the rest of the unit in just a few minutes.